All right, so we are going to go ahead and hop into our discussion and lecture today with Judit Hersko, which we thank so much for joining us to talk with us during these times on Zoom. So my name is Addie Lyon, and I'm a part of the Reuse Project. Today we have Olivia Stevens, Shannon Mandel, and Daisy Camacho. And you'll see us with our backgrounds, so you'll know who is who. First, though, we would really like to speak with Judit and hear just a little bit more about herself and her practice with science and art. Yeah, thank you so much, Judit, for joining us, and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you, Addie, and thank you, Reuse Project. And I hope I get this right. Hill Street Country Club Gallery,
Yes.
for inviting me. I really appreciate and am honored by this invitation. And at first, actually, I'm going to talk about my development as an artist from young to older. And we can talk about the art and science as it progresses at the end. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me just 1 second. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Perfect, yes.
Yes, all right. So let me just start here I'm starting with undergraduate days to show my development and to see how it progresses from more abstract interest in materials and processes to storytelling, actually. So I started out as a fabrics textile person, and I immediately wanted to take that into the third dimension. So this is a three-dimensional weaving. And I was also interested in printmaking. And here you can see my tendency to do very labor-intensive things as a young sculptor. So what you see here are probably about 365 copper pieces put into bent wood. And for each one, I had to make a slightly bigger or smaller hole so it would come out further. So you can see my interest in pattern, in materials, and in sculpture, but certainly very abstract. I learned how to bend wood. I was just very interested in materials and processes as a young person. But I did realize that I wanted to be able to tell stories. At the time, it wasn't about science yet. But human stories, and I wanted to learn how to sculpt the figures. So I sculpted my own hands. This is when I was learning how to sculpt, and this is actually not a cast of my hand. This is a time and a half larger than my actual hands are. I was looking at my hands and sculpting them, and I learned the process of sculpture. And I made portraits of any of my friends. This is still undergraduate. Any of my friends who were willing to sit for me, because this takes hours and hours. This particular sculpture is of my husband, and it's sitting right outside here in the garden. It's concrete, and it's, to this day, this was done, close to, 35 years ago, and concrete is sitting outside in the garden, and it's doing just fine. So again, my friends, and I also did life-size figures. This is a 6-foot figure of one of the models. And this has a funny story because I didn't know what to do with it. It's gigantic, and casting it was a huge project, but we didn't want to throw it away. So they used it as a model for drawing classes at the University of Michigan, where I was when the model didn't show up for classes. So they used my sculpture to draw. All right, so just breezing through. I want to stop at this one for a few seconds because it's relevant for what I do today. Like I said, I was interested in materials, processes, sculpture, and realized that I was interested in storytelling, but it's also a question of what stories to tell. And I was speaking to a graduate student friend, and she said, well, what are some of the defining experiences in your life? And I told her, well, loss, because I left Hungary as a child, as an 11-year-old, and lost everything I knew overnight in my life. So I had some very big losses as a young person that really shaped who I am. And I think much of my work comes from that, frankly. But this first time I was trying to find a way to speak about this experience, and my teacher was really heavily influenced by mythology, and especially Greek mythology. So I turned to Greek mythology. So this is a scene from the mythology of Orpheus and Eurydice. I don't know if you know that story, but Orpheus was favored by the gods. You see the lyre in his hands. He was a musician. And when his beloved Eurydice died, Apollo granted him the ability to fetch her from Hades, from death. And so he descends to fetch Eurydice, but the one stipulation is that he cannot look at her while they're coming up from the underworld. And she's pleading with him so much that you must not love me because you don't look at me, that he can't stand it. And just before they emerge into the real world, he looks back and loses her forever. And this moment of him looking back and losing her forever, it's juxtaposed with a moment later in his life when he comes upon a group of women Amazons who are having a secret meeting. And when they notice him, they hunt him down and kill him. So his moment of death here is sort of put together with his moment of realizing that he is born into death. He cannot get back what he loves that has passed. And that's the experience that has been very important for me. That kind of ephemeral experience of being born into life has been basic to my work. And that's also following now. My friend told me this looks like a self-portrait before going to graduate school. The boat has no oars. You have no idea where you're going. And so that is really, maybe she was right. So then I went to graduate school and really took a turn in how I worked. So this whole idea of ephemeral and passing and change and nothing being permanent becomes part of my work in terms of how I make it. So it's no longer storytelling through a mythology that tells about the passing of life and so on. It is actually the process of the work itself that does it. So if you look here, what I started to experiment with, this is again, a female figure that was cut out from the bottom. That's what's up there. And then the leftover, I hammered with a million holes. Again, I'm very obsessive, or I used to be. And so you can see that process from the younger work as well. And I hemmed in the piece on the top with glass. So it's only glass that holds it in space, if you can see that. So here is a close-up. You can see how there's these broken glass pieces, two pieces that hold it in space that has been wired to the metal frame. And this is the hammered part with the holes. So then I cast it into wax and I put it on fire. So this is, I'm just going to run through the process. I also projected an image of a young woman's profile onto the wax. So I'll just run through the slides as it progressed. It took about altogether, I think 10 hours to burn down. So it wasn't in one event. This was the opening when it was burning down. And again, because it had a projection that traveled to the wall as it burned down and started to project the piece. And then slowly, it started to project the woman there as well. So there was, again, a little bit scary story because you see that the glass is gone now. And I knew that because glass expands from heat and cold. So I knew it would break probably, but it actually ended up exploding. And I was just terrified. And I was so lucky. Someone had been literally this close to the piece just seconds before it exploded. And I was just lucky that it didn't hurt anyone. So the glass exploded and the figure rolled out, which I didn't count on that it would be such an explosion. So here you can see the rest of it burning down and the image traveling onto the wall. Again, still about the subject matter of passing and things changing and just the way life is. This was sort of in the break in between. I burnt it at several occasions, not at once. So this was in between, just the white wax. And then I think this is the last slide. So this was very exciting in terms of a process, but people told me, friends told me, well, okay, but it's a very general subject matter. Who is this? What is this about? Whose life? Why is this interesting or important? Why aren't you talking about yourself if you're going to put a young woman there and so on? That was not me. It was a friend's profile. So I took that to heart. And my next piece was very personal. So I was invited to the Hyde Park Art Center to exhibit. So this piece has 3 panels. If you look at the hanging mechanism up the metal, which I also design and create, all of those things as a sculptor are very important. How do you put something out in space, right? So those metal bars I welded and so on, and made it so that it can go up and down and adjust to the height that I want it to. You have to think of so many things as a sculptor. And I'm including this because I'm thinking of, you know, people learning that whole process now. So if you look at this, these are 3 panels. And if you look at the hanging mechanism, you can see that the middle one is parallel to the wall and the back one is tilted to the left and the right front one is tilted to the right. This is important in terms of what happens on the wall because you see a reflection on the wall, right? That comes from the front panel, which is glass. Do you see it up front? That's the one that tilted to the right. And glass functions as a mirror, even if it's not a backed up mirror. It does reflect images. So that's what's reflect that image on the wall that you saw earlier. The middle one is wax and you see the image on it. So now we have turned to the front. You see the image on it originally. It's projected on there. And I'll talk about the image later. And then the back panel is wax with mirror and glass shards embedded in it. So as the middle one burns down, the image moves on to the third panel and it's projected in shards to the left, which is what you see on the wall, these little shards of light. So that's what you get by the end, is you get a full image to the right from the glass and you get a broken image on the left. From the glass and mirror shards in the back panel. So what this is talking about, the image itself is the woman in the image is not my grandmother, but a woman who raised me just like as if she had been my grandmother. She's holding up a mirror that has my father, myself as a baby, and my sister in the image. And my mother took the picture, but she's not visible because of optics working. If you see someone else, you don't see yourself in the mirror. So we don't see her. So it's called Where Are You? It's not so much about asking where my mother is, although we could, but it was more about how do we construct a sense of self in terms of thinking about life and memory, and how looking back on our lives, we create a story of who we are, right? We do that by picking and choosing from things that we remember from our past and constructing a story of our own. That story could go many different ways based on our experience, and how we construct it is really random in some ways and depends on our vantage point in the present. So I was thinking about these kinds of philosophical questions, and the one with the shards is this broken memory where it could like go, you know, it's sort of fragmented. And in my life, I've moved and changed my life so much that was partially about that fragmentation. Then I moved to San Diego, and I was invited by the gallery at UCSD to exhibit. And this is what their back looked like back then. The UCSD gallery looks very different now. And I created these images or these pieces from family photographs. So I made sculptures based on photographs. And then I embedded them in wax again and burnt them. So it's metal and plaster, painted plaster and glass. And then, you know, weird things happened that I didn't count on, like the paint just evaporated. The red color you see is gone, even though it's white now, that part, it's not black. I was thinking of war images, and there was a big earthquake at the time in Armenia, and I saw images of photographs floating in the air after the earthquake. So these were some of the inspirations for these pieces that are become these relics of, again, things happening, sometimes terrible things. And some of them are vertical, and this one was made out of metal, so it didn't break, of course, in the process. Again, I used light and shadow. I burnt these ones at night so they would get the shadow effect. And then it was exhibited later as a relic. And actually, this is something that someone purchased from me. It's in someone's home now. So the shadow you can see always is part of it. So these are the three vertical ones burning at night. This one in the middle was made of copper. So the copper was really transformed by the fire in this beautiful way, affecting. So again, with the light and shadow, I came to an idea of how I could talk about the ephemeral without actually having something burn and change maybe. So I created these family photographs with a method that I invented, which was to just print on glass with an invisible ink. And it's reflective ink. I embedded sort of silver in it. So you see that up front, but you can't really see it. You see the shadow. It's the shadow on the wall that you really see. So these images sit a couple of inches in front of the wall on the glass, but you don't see it there. You see it as only the shadow. And as a viewer, when you actually walk in front of this, you block out the light and then the image disappears. So that kind of coming and going, that was my mother with her aunt and cousin in Hungary in 1925. This is my father at 20. This is my sister walking me across a field. And this is with my husband before we came to America in 1981. So these are the four images, and then I made them into these wax statues as well. So these are based on these images, somewhat abstracted in this case, more realistic in this case. And again, the wax implies the possibility of passing and burning, although these never did burn. They are permanent pieces. All right, so then I became interested in bringing this whole, I started doing research about the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity and what happens to the human psyche in Western culture and civilization, and how we project how we sort of transition from the body into the mind, and the destruction of the body becomes analogy for moving into the body, into the mind, and becoming good industrialized subjects who can work from 12 hours a day in a factory and control the body. And the whole witch hunts was partially about that purging of our body and our connection in some ways to nature. And it's all played out on primarily women's bodies. And I took this work into other series, so I will return to it. But what I want to say just about this piece and how it's made, it's scratched into the plastic, and these are plastic sandwiches that has all kinds of cool stuff in it, like little tiny bullets, and it has detritus of metal. So you're looking at this cool abstract object, and then you see this image on the wall that you really don't see at all on the plastic because it's just scratched with a needle. So it's totally invisible in the plastic, but the needle scratch stops the light. And so when it's projected on the wall like that with the light, suddenly you see this other thing. So you're very confused as a viewer where that image comes from. And it's all about the projections, again, of our minds and how our minds make up all these stories, whether it's personal or a collective story of truth. So I moved this whole idea into this project, the Black Forest Requiem. I was invited by the Women's Museum in Bonn. And I created this piece that is based on a National Geographic article from 1930s, just before they stopped writing about Germany. This is about this headset that you see on the woman from the Black Forest is what I used for the form of these pieces. And I took the geese from that same article, goose herding a girl and her geese. I took the geese and I just multiplied them as I printed. And on the other side of the glass, I had printed a list of Jewish women who lived close to the museum in Bonn, where I was visiting, and who, their fate. And as up on the front, the geese multiplied as I was printing, it made the image clear on that side, and it revealed this list of women and what happened to them. So again, it's a progressive, it's almost like film frames, right? From left to right. And that's something I want to point out. I tend to work in that kind of sequential way. So the first still life piece that you see on the left, this is a very cool space I exhibited in Hungary. You see the Black Forest piece back there, and then my first still life. And then the Witch Hunt series that I showed you earlier is on the other wall. It's an installation. And then this piece in the middle is based on a Zurbaran painting. And here I was starting to think about, I recreated it in plaster, just looking at the painting, and then projected onto it a Witch Sabbath image that I had used for the Witch Hunt series. So again, I'm using these images together to talk about how this transition from the Middle Age to modernity has this progress of controlling nature, putting it on the table of the household. Here I'm showing how the two images have, if you look at the bottom left, it's the same as this from the Witch Hunt series. So this piece continues to talk about this process of transition from the Middle Ages to modernity. And so do the other pieces that I did with still lives. This is Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, images from that projected onto this still life by Cotan. And then this still life is based on a woman painter, Anvalaye Koster, her image that I recreated in bronze with a stand of wood and a steamer that brings steam through the bowl. And again, I can talk more about the technical parts of this later. I do everything myself. I mean, I do find help. And then I have 3 traditional projectors here that all project an image from a slightly different angle, and the steam works as a back projection screen. So depending on which projector you're facing, you are watching that image. So as you walk from left to right, and again, if we look at my website later, I have actually videos of how this transition happens. As you walk, you see a different image, depending on what you're facing. So this is the middle projector with a dead rabbit. Again, talking about the subjugation of nature and how we treat nature, our own bodies, in this transition to modernity. And this is the third one, this bourgeois household with a mother, adjusting the bonnet on her daughter's head. This whole progress towards control of the body, control of nature, and what that has to do with today, the science, and what's happening to our planet, frankly. This is the last still life I made, and it's created in bronze, as well as, and these are, the original painting has, of course, these wafers, which has religious connotations, of course, with Christ and the wafer, Christ's body. And here I've made them into banknotes. The earliest banknotes that are rolled up. So these are £5 banknotes from the earliest banknotes existing in England. Thinking about value, right? What creates value? So here you have, this is probably technically the most difficult thing I ever made, and I can talk about that later if you're interested. This is a resin version of the same thing, and it's lit from within. So when it was exhibited like this, it looked like it's hovered in space, although actually physically it was sitting much lower than the other one, because I noticed how much it hovers. So I made it lower in the space. And then I took a hiatus and I worked with these Buddha figures for a while. And I'll just screen through this. And if you have questions about it later, we can go back. I was invited at the museum in Hungary to create this installation. And I chose I brought this in one, these are such small pieces that I brought them in one hand luggage to Hungary. And then when I put them up, it just becomes this gigantic thing. But these Buddhas turn around in space, they rotate with 25 degrees each. And then they also merge with the wall. So they disappear into the wall as they rotate. They go deeper and deeper in until there's nothing left. All right, so I was gonna switch to something else now. I know I took longer with this, so I don't know if you want me to take the next 10 minutes or if you want to go to questions instead.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, your storytelling abilities is so amazing and captivating. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Addie. Stop sharing my screen.
All right. So now with our time left, we're going to go ahead and jump into a discussion about your work. Cool. I see Daisy, you're here. Daisy, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yeah. Well, I had one question which you kind of already answered about, like, more specifically in regards to the domestic vapors piece and how working with such projection, how did you did you require the help of others for that specific piece, or did you conduct the research yourself?
I do. I really have to say that as an artist, one of the biggest kicks I get is to experiment with materials and processes and discovering miraculous things that matter can do. And I just happened on this. You know, I experimented with a lot of materials and processes and discovered that water vapor in the air functions as a back projection screen. So basically you project from behind and you see it up front. So I discovered this in just experimenting because as I've said in the first part of the lecture, I always experimented with materials and ways of showing change and process. So whether it was the fire and burning things and the wax disappearing and images moving from one surface to another and changing, I was always looking for other ways to create miraculous effects. And I didn't even include images here of the another series that I did regarding the witch hunt series and the transition, which are white wire drawings that are in front of the wall again that disappear invisible because they're white and very thin. So I just always experimented with ways to make miraculous effects of disappearance and appearance and change. And I came across the water vapor. I didn't really use any help with that. In terms of the production, I had to work with a foundry to cast the bronze, and I did work with someone who helped me change a steaming machine. It's like a steamer you use for your clothes, but I had someone change it so that it could take a tank of water that is much bigger. So it could go and steam for 8 hours, because this piece was shown at the Venice Biennale. So what you saw there for the installation, I was invited to show my work in Venice, and I needed it to go for 8-9 hours a day. So I can see the sun is coming in here. Is that disturbing? Would you like me to pull some shades?
I think it looks fine. I think it looks beautiful.
Okay. So, so does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. And from that made me think of, in your history of work from your undergrad to present, was there one piece of work or project that really influenced you the most after, maybe from what you learned or the people that you met during that?
What an interesting question. Well, what I hope shows here is that as an artist, you really work with very few themes in your life and that you basically vary those and find new ways maybe to speak about those themes. So what I wanted to show was that I'm always been just fascinated with materials and matter and design and patterns and making things as a young person, but that I really wanted to tell stories, and that I started with personal stories, and that personal story was about loss, right? And I came up with a language for that loss through first with the mythology, but then with how I make my pieces that disappear and change, and you can't count on anything staying the same, right? And then I translated that process to the loss we're experiencing today with the earth, right? First, I translated it to the collective memory history part, speaking about how we transitioned from the Middle Ages to modernity, and how we, in that transition, we moved out of our bodies and into our minds and started projecting more and more from here, right? Not living in the body, but in the mind. And all of that is very complex. I could maybe talk about that at more length, but it's just very interesting to me how that transition and how that moving out of embodied experience is related with the birth of science. And actually, I came across, when I did the research originally, so that's has been very influential. That research for the Witch Hunt series really started me on a path to think about science and how it is produced today, because science really arose from some of the from the observational skills of artists who observed nature and drew it and painted it and represented it in images. But then with the birth of science and scientific academies in the British Academy in the 19th century, they stated that it's a male endeavor. That science is a male endeavor, and this whole idea of rationality without embodied experience became sort of, you know, a divorce from that which we're observing, or we're part of nature. We are part of nature, but now we are these other things observing it from the outside. Of course, this has roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where we are supposed to be beyond the rest of creation, right? We are the pinnacle. We're something else, but we are really just part of the same thing. But that is, you know, science has adopted this in a different way, that we are beyond it. We are the observers. We are the outside mind looking at this matter. So in my whole work, I've been trying to break down that division and thinking about those things. And it did emerge from the gradual progress of research from the early work through, and the storytelling part. So I hope you see how these things are all there from the start, but then I found a way to hone it in on something very specific now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I see we have a question in the chat from Melissa. She's asking, have you collaborated directly with scientists, or has your work been research driven in a solitary setting? Also, the presentation that you gave about Anna Swartz and her daughter's journey, how do you see your role in their story as an artist? That's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. So remind me the first part of the question. Oh, solitary. No, it has not been solitary. So when I realized how interested I am in the transformation of matter, when I started teaching at CSUSM in 2003, I really wanted to delve deeper into working with the science. And so I reached out to scientist colleagues, and a few people responded very enthusiastically. One of them was our current dean of graduate research, Dr. De Leone in physics, who I worked with, and I did a really exciting project when I was in Antarctica based on what he and I worked on. And I have slides of that, but I don't think we'll have time to look at those. It had to do with the ozone layer and with the UV rays and how they change matter. So I brought a carpet with me to Antarctica that I put out for the penguins to look at. And I have a really cool sequence of that. So if we have time, we can look at that. But and then I faded it to show that, in fact, to talk about the ozone layer and how we actually decided as a community, global community, to stop that problem, right? So it's possible to do that. We stopped producing the chlorofluorocarbons that produce that ozone hole. So I've worked with scientists, and the person who I worked with most closely, Dr. Victoria Fabry, is part of the story I just told you. She went to Antarctica to study the pteropods, because this change in the waters happens most quickly in the high latitudes, in cold waters, because of the chemistry of the cold water. So she went to Antarctica. She discovered this Antarctic Artist and Writers Grant and told me I should apply for it. And I didn't think I had a chance, but I got it. And I went there 2008, 2009, and worked with other scientists there, and has continued. So currently, actually, I'm working with scientists at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I had a recent show, 400 parts per million, which we also did not have time to get to yet today. I know you had a question about that piece. So I'm constantly working with scientists, yes. So it's a dialogue that inspires my work, that directs my work.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And I see Dinah has a question as well, wondering how you preserve your different artworks.
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, I really thought about that yesterday. And again, letting go of permanence is something that I've had to work on myself, because a lot of these pieces are, of course, impermanent. And how do you preserve them? But actually, there's a wonderful book that just came out by someone who's actually at UCSD, who writes about museums and how they try to preserve art pieces, even traditional ones, like traditional paintings. And nothing is preservable. You know, you have to invest a lot of resources to preserve something or to redo something, like in cultures where you would build in wood and let it burn down and rebuild it, because you know everything is impermanent. You have to redo it. And in fact, the conservators are in some ways redoing things, right? They can't preserve the original exactly as is, because everything that's matter gets transformed. It's affected by atmosphere and time. So a lot of my pieces are, or not a lot, but some of my pieces are owned by museums, and I think they're languishing in storage spaces, and I have no idea what they look like or are like now. I have worked with conservators at some points when they pulled out my pieces in Hungary in the Museum of Contemporary Art to show, and there were issues to contend with. But I accept that some of those pieces might just not emerge ever, and if they do, no one will know how to put them out because I won't be around. And you know, it's part of what my work is about, right? Impermanence.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone asking questions. If you have any more, keep putting them into the chat, please. And now we're going to move to Olivia, who also has a question for you.
Since you mentioned it a little bit, your 400 parts per million series, I saw, I looked through it on your website, and I saw some of the figures you had are made out of Antarctic Earth. And I really wanted to ask how that process went, because that seems really crazy to me. Like, how do you even start with like figuring out how to do that?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Again, I think the reason I went into sculpture is because I love figuring out that kind of thing. How can you make something that seems impossible to make, and I've never seen? So maybe others have made something similar, but I don't know about it. So in this case, I've worked with that kind of process for a long time. So if you remember the piece I showed in the performance lectures, 7 Days of Dissolution, with the human heart and lung made from capiche shells in the water. You all remember that? That is made with the same process. So basically, I make a mold of the sculpture. So in case of 400 parts per million, the female figure I sculpted myself. The heart and lung, I actually purchased, the medical models of a heart and lung, and I took a mold off of that for the 7 Days of Dissolution. And I make, rubber molds that you can use over and over again. And then each time I have to find the right material that will bind the matter I want to bind. So I had to find the right kind of glue. And frankly, now I don't remember which type of glue I used with the Antarctic Earth, but I experiment until I find the right one. You know, it needs to be clear, it needs to stiffen. And then I experiment with the process until I like the effect. So I just used absolutely minimum amount of glue with that one. So some of the earth actually fell away. So if you look at that piece, it looks pitted. And in some places it's hollow cast. So I have two parts to the mold, one side and the other side, and then I put it together. That is actually a very fragile piece. And the first one that I showed in La Jolla, when we were installing that again downtown in the library show, we bumped it and it actually fell to the floor and shattered into a million pieces. So I had to make another one. That one is actually a lot more fragile because there's so little glue in it than the transparent figure in the same piece. And again, you can see how things return for me. If you think of my still life with the bronze and the transparent one, you know, here I'm playing with the same opposition, right? I have this very, very solid earth figure, and then I have the transparent figure with the glass beads, and there's a reason for it, but the ideas are still the same, you know, ephemeral, very earthbound, very material, right? It's light and dark, positive, negative, light and shadow. You can think of a million dualities that we think with, right? That are part of these pieces in both cases. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. That's very helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. All right. And Shanna, you're going to be asking our last question from reuse, and then we'll have a few minutes open in case anyone else has any questions that they would like to ask Judit.
All right, so my question is about the glass bead game, that piece with the Buddhas. I was just wondering what you made that out of, and like how you're able to get it to stay on the wall, and if it's still there to this day.
Oh, these are wonderful questions. It's a very funny thing because that museum, after that piece was done, this was actually a very seminal moment for me because I put that piece up the summer of 2003. And after I put that up is when I found out I got my job at CSUSM. That was the moment. So that piece is sort of forever linked for me with that moment of starting at CSUSM. But also that museum was moving after that. So the Museum of Contemporary Art, as you could see, was in this very historic building. You saw it had these red marble columns, very not modern. It was up in the sort of historical part of Budapest, and they moved into a new Palace of Arts, which was just a state of the art at the time, newly built. So of course, these were probably destroyed when this space was done, but they were there when I left. They were actually just plaster. And I took with me a sample when I was asked to do an installation. I somehow got my hand on a sample of the red marble, and I developed the right mix of colors to mix in with the plaster to match that color so it would blend. But it was plaster, and because the pieces were so tiny, frankly, you know, the Buddha is this big, but then a lot of the pieces were just a knee sticking out of the wall. So I had these columns here at home where I created the actual installation at home. So I created these columns and I figured everything out and numbered everything. So when I got there, I just needed to put it up. So it was all figured out because they were actually rotating in space. So I had to figure that out. And as they were rotating, they were getting smaller and getting deeper into the wall. So there was so many factors to think about. So as I developed that here, then I packed them very precisely with the plan. And then I basically, I swear to you, I put it into one carry-on case. I had it in my hand from here to Budapest. I did not put it on the airplane. I had it up above me in the airplane in one carry-on case. That's where it fit, the whole thing. But it was all figured out and it was all like lined up exactly, you know, with the numbering and so when I was there, I just needed to glue. Again, I needed to experiment with what glue would keep it there. And then I had to work my way at the edges so it would, you know, seamlessly blend in. So it was a lot of work to put it up, but at least I had it all figured out in advance. So it's always a lot of experimenting with materials, doing research about materials, and always testing, double checking. You know, it's like painting a house. They tell you you spend 5 hours, you know, preparing and covering everything and taping the floors and the lines, and then you spend maybe 1 hour painting, right? That's how it is in art. You know, you spend all of that research, the trial and error and making sure it works, and then you make sure it works again, and then you make sure it works again, and you think of everything that could go wrong and you test that. And that's how it works.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, just thank you for joining us today and being a part of our conversation and sharing your knowledge and experience personally and with science. Just a big round of applause and yeah, a lot of appreciation from us. We'll leave for a second. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can definitely put them in the chat or verbalize if you feel comfy to. But yeah, this was our session today. So thank you so much, Judit, and we just really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yes, and I'm seeing in the comments, thank you for sharing your experience and process. Yes, thank you, Melissa. Wonderful.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. You guys were fantastic in researching and having really insightful questions. So thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I hope you have a great day. And make sure to check out the Hill Street Country Club, who is helping us as the Reuse Project organization. They're local in Oceanside. And we're all on Instagram, so we can all stay connected. But all right, have a great day, everyone.